Welcome to UberCube, the podcast where we discuss all things cube, but with refreshments. This is your host, Anthony Adams, aka UberBear, and I'm joined by my other host,
May, also known as Magic.
And
Stu.
Welcome back, Stu.
Thank you.
Where you been, Stu?
Also known as Stu.
Also known as at StuMTG. Yeah, I've been away for a couple of weeks, had a family vacation, and I've also got my folks in town. So it's nice to be back and get back in the studio.
So you walked around the beach asking people if they heard of Cube?
I didn't, but I did make sure to wear one of our official UberCube t-shirts around, hoping to, generate some reactions when I went into the town. And I
probably didn't, because I got those. So, true story, the day before CubeCon, I went to the mall.
I remember.
Yes. And with about 30 minutes before closing, I got one of those guys that said, I can do this for like an extra $5. Can you press these for me really quick? Mm-hmm. And it was like straight up like, you remember those old school ones where you used to get the press-ons like in cereal boxes or whatever, and you just stamp it on the back of your shirt? Yeah. So I've got official ones actually coming. They're in the mail. I didn't tell you that. You get to find out. Comes in this week.
I am excited.
I got you a medium, baby gap size.
Is that what medium?
It's medium.
Okay.
All right. So we've got an interesting conversation for you here. It's going to be about cube curation for the player psychographics, right?
I've never heard that term before. Psychology with graphics?
So the reason why we're talking about this is because our newest Patreon, Preston,
Thank you, Preston.
Friend of the show. We're going to dedicate this episode to this individual who sent me an amazing email that I am 100% plagiarizing while we talk about this stuff. Good job, Preston, for writing my script.
Plagiarizing, shouting it out, same difference.
You can give him some royalties out of his own Patreon, contribution. So,
Preston, you rock. And you had actually mentioned this to me a while back, and you sent me this really detailed email breaking down, I guess, tailoring your cube environment to the player profiles is a good way to say this, right? The personalities involved, which we're going to cover this more expansively here in just a moment.
Yeah, let's first of all do what we always do, because this is a bit of a special one. First of all, May, what you got in your glass or your cup today?
I'm going to be a wine drinker this time. Kirkland brand Cabernet Sauvignon.
Very nice.
So typically she beats us, right?
Of course she does.
But not today.
Not today.
Satan. Not today.
So
we've
Anthony,
got a UberCube jalapeno Sierra Nevada clone that I have been making for the past 2 months. So we're about to officially crack on air.
Let's go ahead. I want
Hopefully
to crack this.
No one gets botulism. Let's go.
Fingers crossed.
Fingers crossed.
All right. So I'd like to actually kick something off with this, because I think player profile might be understating things a little bit when it comes to the terms that we're going to use when it comes to the type of player. Because it's not always the type of player. Sometimes it's the type of mood that player is in. Would you agree or disagree? Because I feel that sometimes I play a cube and I'm just feeling a way that I want to play today. And then sometimes, the next time I play either a different cube or even the same cube, I feel like I want to play a little differently. So maybe it's more...
There's a name for that we're going to talk about in a few minutes. You actually fall underneath a certain psychographic as far as that's concerned.
Do you think so?
Yeah. But me, I'm a very straight edge. I'm actually playing to win. I'm playing to win with a combination of fun, but my intention is, first thing I came in here when I told you guys was, I 3-0'd last night.
You did.
I didn't need to.
Congratulations.
I know, I congratulated me. That's what I did. I guess that really defines my psychographic, right?
I agree.
May, would you mind taking away kind of the bullets here? Because I know you're chomping at the bit to talk about some of these personality types.
The important thing to note is when we're talking about the psychographics is what the psychographics we're actually talking about is. And it was a concept that was initially brought up by Mark Rosewater. And it's essentially the idea that Magic the Gathering customers fit into these 3 psychographics, which has evolved over time to expand as Magic has. But the first main 3 that we're going to talk about for a second is the Tammys, which they're the players that are really into big plays, splashy effects, etc. They like their big dumb things, big dumb splashy things. They like to do the big dumb thing. Jennies and Johnnies are more of the synergy and engine building type, where they see a card and they're like, all right, how can I make an engine out of this? what is this weird combo that I can try to fit into my deck? What is the weird thing that I'm trying to build?
I apologize. Our good friend Greg kind of falls into that. It's interesting as you're saying it. I'm thinking of all these personalities I know. And Greg, not that anybody knows it, but someone may meet him someday. He can't stop engine building to a fault. He says it out loud. Last night he was doing Fiddle Bender, and before that he's doing Birthing Pod, and before he wants to do that self-mill with an engine driven. Can't stop it. So I guess... I apologize for interrupting May, but it kind of comes along the line with Stu says that he can change the mood of his dynamic, but it's interesting. You always have this one center point, this true north as a player and a curator that you fall into. Apologies, May, continue.
The third one is spikes, where they're more focused around win, draft efficiency, and they're looking for the good cards of the environment. They're trying to figure out what the context of the environment is, and they're trying to solve it. Spikes are interested in what wins them the game, and what are the steps that they can take in order to improve and win the game. Those are the major 3 psychographics that were described, but over time, there were 2 more that were developed that kind of sit outside of those customer psychographics and more into the internal magic psychographic. So it's adjacent, and the first one's Vorthos, which they're the ones that care mostly about mechanical tie-ins with flavor. They're interested in what the card does in the aspect of, does this fulfill a certain flavor condition? What's its lore? What is the background of this? What is the curator trying to tell me? They care about the overarching idea behind it.
So like a story-driven player.
Oh, am I going to see these various horror tropes that we're going to expect from things like Innistrad and whatnot? Or with my fake cube of, I'm going to see Squirn Villager and say, that's supposed to be Little Red Riding Hood.
This is like our good friend Lucky Looter that mentioned to me recently on our Discord that when he put an observation of Uberbear's Horror Cube, his first thing was, I see things like Force of Will, Preordain, some of these magic staples, and his Vorthos kind of perspective said, this doesn't fit. Here's some suggestions, because I had opened myself up for the feedback, but he immediately brought back to the Innistrad plane. But my vision as the curator is for it to be Innistrad plus. I'm going beyond that universe, right?
So it's more story driven than like specifically lore.
But they're the ones that catch the outliers. Right. They say this card doesn't fit to what I think you're telling the story to me, right? It's an outlier.
They're the magic connoisseurs.
Correct.
They're the ones searching for that flavor.
And they're willing to sacrifice efficiency for story elements. Like it's a driving factor for them. I'd rather have this card that costs 3 that is pictorially or flavor-wise or flavor text or some kind of story element that they pulled from it fits the theme that they want to see, versus you could have a spell that costs 1, does a much better job, but it simply doesn't fit. It's a way of looking at magic.
They're the types of people who will draft your Monopoly cube and go for trains.deck.
Exactly.
Not because trains.deck is particularly strong in that environment, which I'm sure it is, but just because having a deck full of all the trains is hilarious.
And the Timmys and Tammys will also gravitate because they realize the power level. So that's where it gets in the interesting aspect of it. That's where you get that crossover, that cross-pollination of these personalities. Not everybody's going to be just one thing.
Right.
But it's really interesting to think about it at that level. May, would you mind taking over this next one just because I love the name mostly? It's fantastic.
Melvin.
Melvin.
Melvin. We love Melvins.
We love Melvin.
I would dare to say that most cube curators are Melvins. They are the people who are looking for underlying sub-themes, infrastructure, and foundational design of the environment or of a deck that they're building. They are looking to find mechanical complexity through an environment and how they tie into the whole and the sum of their pieces. While it may sound really close to Johnny at first, the important thing to note about Melvins is that they're more thinking bigger picture as opposed to individual combos or doing the thing that Johnny wants to do. Melvin cares more about, I'm going to play the Aristocrats deck, so I want to get all the mechanical pieces to make Aristocrats as diverse and interesting as possible, so that way I have flexibility and options and whatnot.
They're architecture focused. They're looking for linchpins. They would that would be the individual that I would want to look at my curation of Uberbear's Horror Cube, where I have broken the Innistrad plane rules, but I've made pieces that are necessary components in my mind to make the play experience more advanced. that's the individual that would appreciate that type of aspect, opposed to the Vorthos would look at it as potentially a flavor fail to see something like ponder. You have any thoughts on that, Stu?
So I'm more thinking of it from like, I'm going to go, someone says, hey, I've got a cube, take a look at this cube, or someone's designed a cube. So say, okay, cool, pull up a list on Cube Cobra, let's see what you got. We've talked about this in one of our previous episodes. How are you looking at the cube? Are you just going straight down each of the colors to see what's going on? Are you more of a left to right? Are you possibly looking at, you know, what 1-drops do, what 2-drops do, what 3-drops do, looking at, you know, mana value and how curves work and all that kind of stuff? Are you potentially looking at card types? Are you primarily focusing on each of the different card types? What do the creatures do? What do the enchantments do? And then look for ways to sort of synergize and deck build, and what works, what potentially doesn't work, where the weaknesses are, where the bombs are. I'm looking at what could be cards that I can pick up early that are going to be very, very strong strategy enablers. And also I'm looking at pieces that will just be good value pieces, as well as, you know what, if I draft this card, I really need this card. This strategy really only works if I have this card, whatever the case may be. And I'm not, I want to be able to sort of look at that. And I think that's where looking at it from that approach and really taking, you know, the archetypes and the sub themes and all that kind of stuff and really focusing there. I think that's, I don't want to say the correct, but I think it's a really effective way of looking at the cube and looking at the design, obviously reading primers and seeing what the curators, you know, trying to support or purposefully. But I think taking that look at the cube to really delve into what all those cards are doing and how they fit together. That's kind of how, at least my approach, and maybe that, I don't know, you said that you kind of think of me as being a certain way. I don't know if that means that you look at me as a Melvin. I'm not changing my name to Melvin, Anthony, just not even for the sake of the podcast.
Just Melvin.
Not even for the sake of the podcast. But I like that description, and I like the way that it sort of does a good job of describing someone who can look at a cube in that.
But it's
manner.
a heuristic that's kind of generic. It's seated in that, where the other three were actually a lot more clean categorized. These are organic, the Vorthos and the Melvin. If I am doing, like, oftentimes on either the Discords or Facebook drafting, someone will say, hey, can you take a look at my cube? What do you think? Or they'll put a general broadcast out there. Hey, I'm looking for help. I put on my Melvin hat first, right? That's going that top down. And I'm seeking power outliers is the first range. And then I go back through it again to see if there's the ties that bind, the pieces that the curator intended to be there that bridges gaps, right? Or you know, that's when you find the soul rings and the jittes and the
skull clamps
embedded in this Popper Plus cube that they've made. And you're like, okay, all right, let's sweep through that once. So you treat it like an onion. That's how you do the evaluation from a curation standpoint.
Has layers.
It has layers.
It has layers.
Oh, it stinks.
Before we progress any further, May has something she'd like to add.
Yeah. So, one thing that I want to know about comparing the Vorthos Melvin compared to the primary three is that they're more bigger picture, top-down approaches when it comes to looking at what you're trying to accomplish in your environment. And when you're trying to solve an environment, there is a very, very different approach from a Spike versus a Melvin, even though on paper it looks the same. Because Melvin's trying to look at the mechanics, the overarching picture of, okay, here are these sets of mechanics, these different complexities within your environment, and they're trying to go through the cube list, trying to figure out what the curve is, what everything is, and how it relates to the bigger picture. A Spike is going to be drafting based off of their player experience and their player perspective of they're not going to go through the effort to look through your environment and try to figure out all this extra stuff. They want to know what are the best decks, what am I going to be seeing, and they are going to try to figure it out from their pack one, pick ones. They're going to be trying to figure it out in the draft. They can mechanically improve versus Melvin's kind of look at big picture and are trying to follow the road versus Spikes are trying to follow the road in the dark.
Do you think, though, it makes sense for someone who is a Spike, like, and we have someone in our play group, Kevin,
Kevin,
Got-
that's
got
exactly what I
married
thought of.
recently.
Yeah, he's currently in Venice.
He's in Monaco.
Monaco.
Sent me a picture.
Very moving Kevin.
Yes. He is someone that definitely fits into that spike category, right? He is playing to win, greatness at any cost. He wants to, fun is zero sum. He's that kind of player. He wants to win.
His fun is his fun.
His fun is his fun.
Yeah.
His fun is, I don't care if you are having the most miserable and I'm playing the most degenerate deck. Does it not behoove a player like that, though, to really gain an understanding of the cube to understand that? Because it's not always about the primer. It's not always about just what comes around in the draft, right? Sometimes you would need to understand things at a strong level before you even open pack one. And for someone like him, and I'm not saying it's just him or just his player type necessarily, but I think there's an element of ego there. If we're going to sort of continue with this psychoanalysis of the player types, he is the kind of player, and I would say that I could see a bit of myself in this as well, that I could also be potentially arrogant enough to think, I don't need to look at one list, I don't need to look at one card, I am a good enough drafter, player, whatever the case may be, I'm going to storm into this thing blind and go 3-0-6-0, no problem. Whereas someone who is a little bit more mindful, and this is where sort of the difference between that Melvin versus Spike that you're talking about comes in, is that the Melvin is going to take a bit more time and effort to look through those lists and maybe even look for something that the curator themselves has missed, right? And but again, going back, maybe the Spike might think that, maybe their ego might tell them that, hey, I can see synergies and interactions and subtypes and all that kind of stuff that maybe the curator hasn't noticed. So
about limited players in particular, and this extends to all of limited, not just Cube. And some of the best limited players and the people who play professionally, etc., they learn the most efficient cards of the environment, and they learn what those cards are and what's going to come up, so that way they can make more efficient draft decisions. Everything comes down to how they draft better, and understanding the environment comes down to understanding what's their most valuable pick and what increases their win percentage for picks, etc. Melvin, while they are still adjacent, Melvin's just kind of look at a bigger picture stuff and see it's not that this one card is really, really inefficient. It's that, it's part of a deck that's really stupid in this environment. Versus a Spike is going to look at that big list and be like, what are the most efficient cards? What are the best cards? I want to draft the good cards. What cards am I going to pick? So that way I can, and prioritize, so that way I can increase my win percentage.
Yeah.
So what's interesting is these psychographics, we have to look at them both from the predictive model of what you think your players are going to do with your environment, but you also have to kind of define this for yourself as the game designer, as the curator, right?
Agreed.
And you can have two different hats on while doing this, right? You may want to play one way, but you may want to design another. And I find myself a lot of times like that. Like as a designer, I'm a Vorthos type of designer. But from a player perspective, I find myself somewhere between the Johnny and the Spike, because I like the complexity, I like the moving parts. That's why self-mill as a design draws me in so much. I like the setup, I like the design of it, but it's not necessarily the most efficient, but it also appeases that complexity for me as well too. It doesn't make Magic boring. I want to do I guess I'm a little bit of everything. So I want to do the big thing, right? I want the spider spawnings. I want the Jace, Wielder of Mysteries, to go off. Lab Man. I want to get it back with Necromancy last second. I want to gotcha. That's really rewarding for me.
It's important to note that when it comes to a lot of these psychographics, and what Stu said at the beginning, is that it absolutely can be diverse, because even though the psychographics are rigid, people are not. What our perspectives are and how we develop as players and the things that we're interested in even day by day changes, it's fluid, etc. Sometimes you could be feeling one thing more than another, and sometimes people are completely adverse to one or more drawn to others.
I would agree 100%. There's definitely times when I will show up, I know we're going to draft, I don't know what cube we're going to draft, but I'm thinking, you know what I want to do today? I just want to smash face with creatures. Or I might show up and think, you know what I want to do today? I want to build a Staxy deck. I want to do something that's a bit of a pain in the butt to play against. Or I might feel like I'm going to try and look for some degenerate combo deck, control deck or something like that. I think it is, at least for me, I would say it's very much mood driven rather than a type of player that I am.
Yeah, so I think it's good to put names to the faces with some of these ideas. And I think certain cards play into these roles as we've moved through them, and we'll kind of talk that out. It's just taking something like a Timmy and a Tammy. There's going to be a card, and we're going to list those off, that kind of fits into that dynamic. So if you're the curator and or you're the player watching out for this, you can kind of identify what you're chasing, right? Mm-hmm. Jennie's and Johnny's, something like I put in this birthing pod, which we'll talk about more of these, is a very engine-driven type of deck. They're drawn to that type of thing. And we talked about with spikes, they want the efficiency. So stuff like Inquisition of Kozilek really just hits the mark for that type of personality. They're staying that very low mana curve. Getting the most out of their mana is, I guess, would be a good summary for that. Would you agree, May?
Yeah. So a lot of the things when it comes to curating for Johnny's in particular is making sure that you have interesting engine pieces to draw them in. Something that gives your players aha moments, because I'm constantly bringing it up on the podcast. We're constantly talking about it off the podcast, because it's important to create those seeds for your Johnny players, so that way they can kind of figure it out, lead the trail that you've left, or if they've been in your environment long enough, they start to develop their own thing within your environment, and it gets their own emergent deck building from it. Johnny players are interesting in that aspect when it comes to building around them and creating those packages for them.
I think of all of these, the 5 with the 3 major and then the 2 subcategories, the one that I think is the hardest to appease of this is the Vorthos. And I'm going to give an example why. Like they're looking at the lore. They're looking at everything comes together from story-driven elements, or it followed the exact plane, or it was within this block and doesn't go outside of that. So their rules are very defined. So if they're the player looking at it from a Vorthos standpoint and you're the curator, I can see this one being the hardest one to defend. And so an example of that, and this one's funny, I picked this off the internet. The Form of the Dragon, it really falls in this. I thought this was interesting. This is one of those for 4 colorless and 3 mountains. You get an enchantment. At the beginning of your upkeep, Form of the Dragon deals 5 damage to target creature or player. At the end of each turn, your life total becomes 5. Creatures without flying can't attack you. And the reason why I chose this card is it's not efficient. It's not extremely powerful, but it's screaming. It's just dripping with story. Flavor to the max, right? Yep. So if you found something like this in a cube environment, or something like Day of the Dragon, or something along those lines, where you know that this person is more into the big picture story, I think sometimes as a curator, they're the hardest to appease. When you said, here's my cube, I built it, it's Innistrad in my example. And they look at it and go, well, this has got Ponder in it. That doesn't seem so Innistrad-y, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that does happen. May, do you have any thoughts on that?
Timmy's are like, oh, I want to play my big dumb dragon. Vorthos is like, I can become the big dumb dragon. I don't agree that Vorthos is the hardest to appeal, because Vorthos, I believe, sits in a camp where when we're playing cube, our expectation of that cube, unless it's specifically a flavor cube, is usually going to be rock bottom. And when it comes to appeasing Vorthos, a lot of it comes from them finding the breadcrumb trails of flavor, or trying to tie in what cards fit for what reasons, or even when you were mentioning like some of the cards in a Monopoly cube, your face lights up instantly as soon as you're like, do you know what this is? And then it's just like, I don't know, you're like, it's the hotel. And I'm like, oh, okay. And you get so excited for it. Yeah. That's your Vorthos moment.
Yeah.
Things like those are what Vorthos players are looking for. Vorthos is a lot of those looking for the high moments. Here are the flavor. I'm trying to seek it out, and I don't think that that's particularly difficult to appease to.
They're all about that 37
majority of
pieces of
environments
flair.
aren't tailored towards the flavor.
Yeah.
Well, what about the numbers, though? Like, let's talk about, think about our group, right? Anthony, and May, you do the same. How many of the players in your groups would you consider to be that type of Vorthos kind of player, where they're intentionally, and a majority of the time, really looking for the flavor, the lore, to be the priority decision maker for them while they're drafting?
Myself and David of the curators.
Okay.
Drafting wise, I can't off the top of my head just think of somebody that's like chasing stories.
Do you think anybody is?
David.
Is he
David
always
David's our judge friend in our group.
He is?
He is always chasing the story elements. He's in love with that idea. Like he looks at the flavor fail story elements. He wants him to pull that.
I would agree with that. And here's the thing. One of the reasons why I actually think this could be a bit of a hidden gem, if you are I don't know, maybe you could argue new to a cube, is because Magic is designed in a certain way, right? Especially if you look at individual sets. If you've got a cube where you've got like, you know, an Innistrad kind of style, if you're looking for the story elements, I think you might be fairly likely to potentially stumble upon interactions, cards that work well together, things that fit, sub-themes, that kind of stuff. So maybe there's potential there for someone to sort of use that methodology, use that mindset to draft, but in a way, they're also finding those interactions and finding those sub-themes and finding cards that work together, because the story kind of alludes to that being the case with the card design.
I agree with that.
Let's talk about ourselves, right? As we never do.
Sure.
We never talk about ourselves.
Who are we?
Let's start with, I'm going to start with May.
Hi.
Hi, May. I would like to interview you for your Magic the Gathering personality. So I'm going to first ask you, what do you consider yourself? Do you consider yourself to be sort of pigeonholed, if I would say, into one of those 3 or even the 5 categories that we've talked about today? Or would you consider yourself to be a mood player? Or tell us how you categorize yourself.
I think it's very difficult for me to categorize myself because I sit somewhere between Jennie, Tammy, and Vorthos. Somewhere between sometimes all of them. I like to build the dumb engines, but sometimes I also just like to build I'm trying to think of an example. I recently just built an EDH deck that has like all the station cards and all the module cards. Not because I'm trying to go for the combo or trying to make an engine out of it, just because I thought it would be funny to have a manufacturing type thing going on with that deck. And reasons like that, I'm like, oh, I'm clearly Vorthos. But sometimes I just like to play a big dumb dragon to turn sideways.
So another question that I have for you, that was your player aspect and kind of a little bit of your sub design, but what's your curator personality?
I think that we as curators sometimes need to adjust ourselves to understand the perspective of different player types. So like you said earlier, is that you sometimes have to put on a different hat depending on what you're trying to do. And when it comes to appeasing your demographics to make sure that the people that you're playing with want to actually play your cube, is that you have to kind of put on their perspective. And I will note that earlier I said the 3 other things that I'm not. Interestingly enough, I'm not Melvin, I'm not Spike, right? And when I'm building my environment, one of the hardest things that I've had to do was put on the Spike hat and figure out how I can make cards not only just flavorful, etc., but also playable, efficient, etc. Whatever can translate into my environment to, these are the efficient cards for you to draft into. These are the ones that you want to go towards to increase win percentage. And trying to figure out the perspective of my Spikes players, because I have a majority of Spike players.
Do you find yourself with bias? And I'll pose this to you, May, but also with like the player, the kind of player that you see yourself as. Do you tend to think that when you're initially designing a cube that you're kind of leaning towards your own play styles and favoring your own play styles, and then that bias that you've got, now you have to kind of force yourself to consider those other play styles? And maybe how complicated does that make sort of the 3rd stage or 4th stage of the design process?
Thankfully, I don't think it's too bad, just because I tend to build lower power like environments anyways. And the advantage of lower power environments is that there's a lot more diversity, and the issue is with when you get to higher power levels is that the amount of available cards greatly reduces, the amount of fun things that you can do with all those top cards reduces, etc. More versus the main issue with enjoying those low power environments is that there are so many options, so many different cards, that it is so difficult to define the power between your best cards and your worst cards. And when you're first starting off your cube for the first time, it's so easy to get into the lane of biases. It's so easy to just start off by being like, oh, these are a bunch of cards that I want to play. I think that's what a majority of us do as curators, is that we're trying to make an environment of, these are cards that I want to play, but then we have to expand our perspective to include what other people want to play in that environment.
So I've got a different so I have so many cubes at this point that I've actually been able to design cubes around these personalities is kind of the central theme focus. Does that make sense? So the Monopoly, Vorthos, I mean, it does that, it pieces that all the way down. The Munson Cube, Eddie Munson, Lords of Metal, it was all about playing Gojira, playing Sepultura, Metallica. That's Vorthos. Like, that whole thing is a story. Every card tells a story of Joven's concert, the 10th Street tour, right? Literally, that's my top-down build design.
And I think, I would, if you don't mind, I actually like the fact, and this maybe raises an interesting point, that the story doesn't have to be, as we probably said on a number of occasions, it doesn't have to be a Magic story. It can be any story. It can be a story that you're creating just with the cards that are in your cube. And I love that you've got this story-driven mentality that you're putting into that, because that cube is just a blast to draft. It's really, really fun to play. So that really does give you an idea of how creative you can be with your storytelling.
And then you go into the artifact cube, it really appeases more of that Johnny Jennie type of aspect.
You think?
Yeah, so it's a lot more KCI combo-ish, stacking, moving parts, moving pieces, birthing pod, great hinge, Bolsa Citadel.
Complex.
There's complexity levels, and I really designed it behind that. Yes, there's something in there for everyone, but that's the most complex cube. Really fits that type of mold, right?
Yep.
And then I go into, say, my Uberbear's horror cube, and I've struggled to inject complexity into it due to the factional or typal-driven vampires, werewolves, etc., that now I'm having to force in stuff like self-mill, and we're going to talk about this more, but inserting for the players that are seeking more complexity, more depth. So it's a little bit more centered on the Timmy Tammy type versus the Jennie Johnny. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And I can see that, it's not going to be easy, is it? When you're looking at your Spikes and you're looking at your Johnnies and you're looking at your Timmy Tammys, depending on the kind of cube that not everything has like an ultra fast combo available in the kind of power level that you're looking for, or even the colors that you're looking for, or the flavor that you're looking for. So maybe I'm going out on a limb, but I'm going to imagine that the Timmy Tammys and being able to swing with creatures maybe the most straightforward to put together, at least at its most core conceptual level, which is someone wants to swing with big creatures, whereby the Johnnies and the Spikes is probably going to be a bit more complicated when it comes to a curation and a design perspective.
So let's also note that things like Fireball, whatever, so there are some cubes that have like Channel Fireball, whatnot. I would consider that a very Timmy deck. That is, I have Channel, I have Fireball, I want to play the big dumb Fireball.
Right. So what inspired this episode? Well, our good friend of the show, Preston, reached out. But why did they reach out? It's because May and I talked about the Monopoly. And during that particular episode, we made a statement. I, in particular, made a statement. And I talked about my good friend, Guafa Hazid, the Profiteer, or Profiteer, rather. He's not the Profiteer, because there may be others where he's at, but he's trying to lock down that base. So, response that inspired the episode. I posed a question in the Monopoly that Spikes would disregard Guafa. Preston counters that Spikes would evaluate the power level of the environment and determine that Guafa is an outlier with potential. Context matters.
So first of all, you as the curator, is Guafa Hazid, does the power level of this card, is it an outlier?
In the Monopoly, it is.
In the Monopoly, yes.
What Preston is suggesting is that Spikes have the ability to adapt. And that they may initially... So my argument for... Let's talk about Guafa Hazid. Guafa Hazid, Profiteer, for one colorless and one plains, one island, you get a legendary creature, human rogue. You can tap, Azorius is the cost... Put a bribery counter on target creature you don't control. Its controller draws a card. Creatures with bribery counters on them can't attack or block. It's a 2/2. Everyone has a price is the flavor text. We talked about this during the Monopoly episode. And it is a lower powered environment. But strangely enough, this card actually shines in that environment. And my statement was I feel like Spikes would overlook this initially, dismiss it. And Preston made the counterpoint that in context of the environment, a Spike in its true nature would see the value of a card like this and not look at it as strictly face value.
I would agree. And the reason is that it's in Azorius. Azorius typically has some of the stronger control aspects. And a creature like this that allows you for only 2 mana and to tap it, it's a little on the slow side, admittedly. It's 3 mana to cast and then 2 mana and a tap to activate. but this gives you a very, very strong control effect for only 3 mana in any cube that's going to be on the lower power level wise. And I think for myself, as someone who does enjoy playing control, I would look at a card like this, and if I was already in those colors, or even if I saw this early on, I would look at this as a bit of a signal that, hey, there's some serious control aspects in this cube, and this is kind of a premium piece for that, because the ability to be able to lock down your opponent's creatures, the premium threats, even at the cost of them drawing a card, that to me is a very strong signal that this is going to be powerful in that kind of archetype.
Which brings an interesting counterpoint, is that it's not just context matters, but efficiency context matters. But my counterpoint to that is, on first glance, on rate, this is 3 to cast, 2 to do the thing, tap it. Completely blows out of the water the definition of a spike with the Inquisition of Kozilek type of mentality.
Sure.
But that's context driven. May, do you have thoughts on that?
So the thing about Guafa is that it is a multifaceted cards, and sometimes cards fit into multiple categories. And I think that this is an example of a card that both fits into this very Vorthos heavy concept of, the mechanical flavor of this is that I am literally bribing your creatures. You are drawing cards. I am bribing you so your creature can no longer do its thing. You'll still get your abilities or whatever, but it just can't hit me anymore. It can't block me anymore. And I can see it with significant enough investment, etc., that it could be used as a win condition. But I would also argue that it can be perceived as a spike card in the context of your environment, because a lot of things won't be able to get around Azorius's control aspects for that investment to not pay off anymore. Because as soon as Guafa's off the board, those creatures can just attack and block. It's not tied to the counter, and you just gave them a bunch of cards. So say Guafa puts a bunch of counters on stuff, they draw a bunch of cards, and then they shock the Guafa. It's going to feel pretty bad.
Was that Peter Gabriel that did Shock the Guafa, or is that Shock the Monkey?
You know, I'm not a Peter Gabriel aficionado, although I did get one of his albums when I was about 8 years of age. But yeah.
I will also note that the thing that's appealing for Spike players is that it is a mana dump. And even though it is a do-nothing for the first round that it comes down, in the context of your environment, you have a lot of slower cards and a lot of slower interaction that causes Guafa to have a bit more leniency when it hits the board. How often is it going to be removed the same turn that it's going to be put into play?
Yeah.
How often is somebody going to get the value from turning things off while keeping Guafa on the board?
Exactly. And I'm looking at timing as well. Like, I'm thinking, certainly again, in a lower power environment, how quickly do I need this to come down and to begin to be able to activate it before I believe that I'm really maximizing the value? Am I worried about it in the first turn, the second turn, even the third turn? Probably not. It's going to be in those later turns when a card like this, as you said, that can shut off those creatures and prevent them attacking or blocking. I feel like that's when I'm going to get the most value. It's a pretty straightforward way of evaluating it, but I think it's correct, especially, again, like I say, in something that's a little lower powered, and potentially you are going to be more reliant on creatures turning sideways to win games.
All right, so let's kind of cheat off of Preston's homework now, right? So thank you, Preston, again, for writing this portion, but we're going to kind of move through how you, as a curator, can develop your cube to fit these certain personality types, and we're going to give some active examples, right? So Timmys and Tammys, as per Preston, cheating off his homework, like splashy effects, right? The shorthand for this is often huge creatures, though I would argue that other impressive game actions apply as well, such as suddenly filling the board with tokens, hitting a Planeswalker ultimate, or storming off. People will likely fight me on this last one. That's I won't, but the storming off is, I think, is what he's going with. That's the spiky one, but I agree with what you're saying there, and I'm going to add context to that in a second. Or drawing a pile of cards or generating gobs of mana along the way, say Grape Shot. So I understand what you mean, like the hyper-efficient version of Storm, but let's pretend for a second that we did Chatterstorm. That falls into the big play. It's goofy. It's not a win con. It's not the same as, say, going off with Lion's Eye Diamond versus, whatever.
Through the Breach.
Yeah, all that nonsense. That's more the spiky version of Storm. So I think there's variations of Storm that falls within these two different types of personality realms. So I think that one's okay, Preston. I agree with that.
I
Would you?
agree.
How about you, May? What do you think about that idea? Does that little aspect of Storm, in the context that I made it to win this case, win? Chatterstorm.
So I do agree that Timmys and Tammys aren't just about big creatures, even though that is kind of their mascot. That's their de facto. That is what they're known for, is the big dumb creatures that turn sideways. I even made a note when you were officially, initially, not officially, were making a draft of this. And it was interesting that you had a bunch of these spells and none of the big creatures on the list. And I was like, no. You gotta have the big dumb creatures. Because that is what the Timmys are known for, right? And they can be the big dumb spells. I mentioned Fireball earlier. We have Rolling Earthquake on the list. Doing the big dumb thing is part of it. I would say that there isn't much of a technical difference between playing a bunch of random cantrips and then going into Grave Shot compared to just Channel Fireball. Not say that there is a lot of interest difference.
So, Stu, would you mind picking up these first two? Because I know you'll love them. And one of them specifically was chosen for you.
I appreciate your consideration. So, again, this is moving on with the Timmy Tammy, the signpost cards for that kind of player. So, the first one I'm going to talk about, and this is one that I'm pretty confident that our podcast, the UberCube podcast, is going to mention this card more than any other content creator out there. And this is Leatherback Baloth. This is a green. It's a vanilla 4/5, and this
Is it though?
It is. Look. There was a time when I used to play Modern. I've talked about this in the past. There was a Modern deck that I used to play that actually was not too unpopular back. This is going back many years now, but it was a mono green deck that sort of relied upon being able to be hyper efficient mana wise because it's mono green. Being able to use creatures that had a lot of green pips in their casting cost for combat tricks. And this was an amazing card in that deck. Like, this was a 4 of in the deck that I played, right? Because it's 3 green pips. But for a deck like that, it was incredible. It was incredibly strong. And it's cool, right? It's 3 green mana. It's a 4/5. To be able to get 4 power and 5 toughness on the battlefield on turn 3, even if it's, it's not super easy to cast, with being that it is triple green. But if you're going mono green, like, maybe a Timmy or Tammy would, then it works great. And yeah, I mean, this card I think is underappreciated, and I think it's in the top 10 cards all time of Magic.
And the reason why I asked Stu to pick this card up, besides his obsession with this card, right, is I wanted to show that within the categorization of the Timmy Tammy, the next card that Stu is going to read, I want to show that this also falls within the same categorization. Carry forward.
Yeah, so this is Carney T, Carnage Tyrant, 4 colorless green, creature dinosaur, can't be countered, trample hexproof, 7/6. So you get a 7/6 for 6 mana, trample hexproof. Interesting, and I know there's been a lot of discussion about power creep. We've talked about it, it's been all over the socials, but it's crazy to look at this and think, like, what give me your opinion on this now, just in the grand scheme of things, right? How powerful? You don't need to give me a scale. But how powerful do you think this is?
Leatherback Baloth and Carnage Tyrant go into a pit, and I want to start just throwing down some dollar bills and see who comes out alive. What do you think? Like
that isn't going to be close.
Fight Club is going to be so close.
But look, Carney T is like double the mana, right? It's
Leatherback don't care about no hexproof.
It don't. And it's a 4/5. Like, can I do an extra couple of damage?
All right, so we're going to move past this nonsense because we've done that. But I wanted to put that within the player demographic, or the what's the word I'm looking for?
Psychographics.
Yeah, I want to put that within the player psychographics to help give realization that those 2 cards land somewhere on that spectrum of a Timmy Tammy. This next one, though, is for May, and May has a story to tell and how this one can be grafted into that idea as well.
So I'm not sure what environment it would go into, but this is just a card that I personally really like, and it's a card that I have a very particular love for because I used it to top during the limited that it was in, and it's Ammon Eternal. It is 2 and a black for a zombie crocodile demon, very fun types. It's a 5/5 with a flick 3, which means that when it becomes blocked, defending player loses 3 life. Whenever an opponent casts a spell, put a -1/-1 counter on it, and whenever it deals combat damage to a player, remove all -1/-1 counters from it. So I'm a big fan of this card because it fills that Timmy role that it is a big dumb creature you can get out for cheap. It's always going to get through the damage. The amount of damage that you deal for the amount of investment that you put into it is always going to be really, really good. And at worst, you force your opponent to have to 1-for-1, and in that environment, sometimes 2-for-1 it. And you can use it to put a lot of pressure on your opponents, and that is something that Timmy's like to see.
And you mentioned that you would like to dark
3 mana,
ritual into
5/5.
this too, right? You wanted to hit the dark writ into this, and that really appeased your Tammy aspects of getting this out fast and hitting them with a 5/5. I think that was our pregame conversation we had about this one.
Oh, absolutely.
I hate this card.
Don't hold back your feelings.
I
Steve.
hate this card.
Because it looked at Leatherback Bailoff in a funny way, or what happened here?
It did. It looked at Leatherback Bailoff and it disrespected it. But
it's
no, the reason
better.
why I hate this card is because we actually have this card in our dumpster fire cube.
It's amazing in there.
And I was playing against our good friend David that we talked about just a few minutes ago. And David had drafted a mono black deck. And I thought I was real fancy with the deck that I was drafting. And game one, he cast this card and it ended the game right there. There was no way for me to deal with it. And then the second game, he didn't have this card and I ran away with it. And then the third game, he got this card again and absolutely ran. Like, this card single-handedly won 2 games for him. Nothing else mattered. He 3 mana, Amit Eternal. There was no way I could deal with it efficiently. It was either chump block to Oblivion, which I didn't have the resources to do.
Or draft removal.
That's an easy thing to say. But the problem is, this costs 3 mana.
Opening removal?
And the dumpster fire
Elegant
cube,
removal?
it doesn't really have like Swords to Plowshares or Path to Exile or ways for me to get rid of it easily. I would like to take the sword to that card, chop it right down the middle. Anyway.
Hey, so let's get into something different. So that's kind of the creature aspects, right? So we kind of did it was the Timmy Tammy, but now we've got some more, as mentioned by Preston, the X spells. So something like Rolling Earthquake for X, and for 1 red mana, you get a sorcery. Rolling Earthquake deals X damage to each creature without horsemanship and each player.
This card is incredible.
I love this card, actually.
Great
Yeah, it's from Portal 3 Kingdoms. Thank God they reprinted this eventually, but yeah, it was amazing. But that X spell variant plays into that demographic that we're talking about,
It does.
right? And then we got this next one, though. Steve, would you mind grabbing this one, please?
This is a favorite of mine.
I know,
As
I
I'm
know.
sure it's a favorite of many, no surprises. So this is Sneak Attack. 3 colorless, 1 red. Enchantment. You may pay a red. You may put a creature card from your hand onto the battlefield. That creature gains haste. Sacrifice the creature at the beginning of the next end step. This is, as we mentioned on many occasions during our podcast, not a card that you can just kind of throw in there for flavor because you're thinking, oh man, Sneak Attack, that must go in this cube because it fits all the flavor requirements. This is a absolutely, I would say, almost semi-broken, if not broken card. Incredibly powerful, but definitely in that Timmy Tammy sort of mindset, you're looking at a way that, hey, I can just pay 4 mana, put this on the battlefield, and then, let's say I get this down turn 4. If I've drafted mono red, or even, if I haven't, I can untap next turn and I can just pay as many red mana as I have available to put as many cards, as many creature cards as I have in my hand onto the battlefield and swing them. Most of the time, do you even care if they're getting exiled? No, because you're trying to win that turn. But especially fun with the...
cheat out your Leatherback
really
Bailoff.
cheat.
Right?
I can.
Yeah, you can.
I can.
Yeah.
Cheat out my Eldrazi Titans as well.
Hey, May, would you mind taking on this next one? I think appeases the Timmy Tammy type of role here. And it's a new and flashy one that I need to
Is
order.
this the best Timmy Tammy
I
card
gotta
that's
order
ever
this
been
card.
printed?
I gotta order it.
I do too, but is it... May, I'm going to ask you this question. Do you think this is the best Timmy Tammy card that's ever been printed when you
Besides
talk about
Leatherback Bailoff.
it? Yes, besides Leatherback.
Yeah, we're going for a record.
Well, of course, you give me the hard to pronounce one. The card is Fourth Earlingus. Earlingus?
Perfect.
The
It's
thing
X,
you do after
red,
you leave
white
Waffle
for
House,
a
the joke is
sorcery.
now stale.
What?
Never mind.
What is Anthony's obsession with Waffle House in this episode? Mate, we're
I
very
don't
sorry.
know. Create X 2/2 red human knight creature tokens with trample and haste. Whenever one or more creatures you control would deal combat damage to one or more players this turn, you become the monarch. This card's incredible. I would say that cards like this, where it makes a ton of creatures and they immediately come in, they get a lot of value, and you get a draw card at the end of the turn. That is important. It is incredible value, and at a certain point, it is effectively another creature in your deck.
Yeah, I need to get one. So let's kind of move over to. There's not a whole lot to say except that card's awesome.
It's
I gotta order it.
unbelievably strong.
It. Yeah, it's amazing. I think we all agree.
I want a draft of vintage. You've got to put this in your power cube.
Yeah,
and I
Johnny's
want
getting cut over
literally
this. Unfortunately,
I want 6 cards that are the most efficient mana producing cards, and I want that in my opening hand every time, and I swing.
So the next thing offered by Preston, Stu, would you mind taking away this summary here of Jennies and Johnnies?
Yeah, Jennies and Johnnies. So approach deck building as a form of self-expression, mechanically and / or thematically. They enjoy putting pieces together to make something greater than the sum of its parts. A Jennie Johnnie may enjoy engine building, finding surprising interactions and or riffing, great word, on the established themes of a cube. I thought of them when you talked about train.deck. They're like, as May, I love these, the aha moments, discovering unique builds or complex interactions that require engines being built. So I quoted that verbatim, but I think that really does cover that Jennie Johnnie mentality very nicely.
So let's talk about some aspects within our cube environment, specifically right now mine, that I try to inject into these environments to play to that style. So in my horror cube, and tell me if I'm right or wrong on this, I use something like Buried Alive. For 2 colorless and 1 swamp, you get a sorcery. Search your library for up to 3 creature cards and then put them in your graveyard, then shuffle your library. So that is the setup portion. Less engine, but it is mechanically and sound as far as the same idea, right? Mm-hmm. And then something as a follow-up later in the game is Living Death. For 3 colorless and 2 swamps, you get a sorcery. Each player exiles all the cards from their graveyard, then sacrifices all the creatures they control, then puts all the cards they exiled this way onto the battlefield.
Yeah.
So theoretically, this is a setup aspect. It's a little different than what we're going to talk about here in a moment. It's less mechanical, fixated around this one card. It's not an engine, but it is an engine that required step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4, win. And so I think that falls in that categorization. What do you think, May?
So the difference between, say, Channel Fireball and the Living Death is that it affects the way that you're building your deck. Channel Fireball, it's just 2 cards that you can throw in. Maybe you can get some other things that could take advantage of Channel, whatever. Maybe some other ways to generate mana for Fireball. But it is a Timmy play because you're specifically trying to get out that big X spell and you're trying to get a ton of mana into it so that you can play your big spell. You can do your thing. Buried Alive, Living Death, etc. relies on you building your deck in such a way that you can fill your graveyard. The ways that you can take advantage of your graveyard being full and your opponent's being relatively empty, and then just immediately hitting the Living Death at like turn 5 or so, and then just taking over the game. And that is the fundamental difference between Timmy's and Johnny's, is that Timmy's, they'll play the additional combos, sneak attack, whatever, when it is just that one-off play, that incidental synergy, etc. for their big dumb play. Versus something like Living Death requires that deck building, not experience, but that deck building restriction.
Yeah, I think this one requires thinking plays ahead versus sneak attack is in the moment. Is that you got it in your hand,
Agreed.
You fire it, right?
Agreed.
They both have complexity, but this one takes more. This one's very riskier too. This is more open to sabotage from the opponent.
And a perfect example of this, if Stu wouldn't mind taking over this one.
So this is Birthing Pod. This is maybe one of the most notorious cards of the last number of years. Typically nowadays, because a lot of people consider this to be a card, it's banned from Modern, and it was banned from Modern at a time where it enabled some shenanigans with cards that at the time were considered incredibly broken or incredibly high-powered. The sort of the poster child for the Modern deck with Birthing Pod was a card called Siege Rhino. I don't know if you remember good old Siege Rhino, but it's a creature card that came in, your opponent, opponent loses 3 life, you gain 3 life. At the time, it was considered a broken enabler for cards like that, and as Wizards are typical to do, they will sort of skirt around it a little bit, but ultimately Birthing Pod gets banned. But this is the absolute prototypical engine card, in my opinion. It's incredibly strong. So Birthing Pod, 3 colorless and 1 green Phyrexian. 1 colorless and a Phyrexian, tap it, sacrifice a creature, search your library for a creature card with converted mana cost equal to 1 plus the the sacrifice creature's converted mana cost to put that card onto the battlefield, then shuffle your library. Activate this ability only anytime you can cast a sorcery. So this is another card that, you know, on the surface, I can see originally when I very, very first, I'll go all the way back when I very first picked up Magic, and I've talked about this with other kinds of effects. Look at, like, sacrifice a creature. I don't want to sacrifice a creature. I like my creatures. But the more that you start to realize, again, just how strong of an engine a card like this can be, you could be sacking creatures that you want to leave the battlefield trigger. You could just be sacking creatures because you know that you've got that higher value with the higher CMC cards. I don't even think you need to build around this card as much as you would around some of the other sort of engine effects. I think you can just kind of put this in however. Yes, you can do it. You have to do it at sorcery speed. Instant speed would be unbelievably broken, but a great Johnny card because it allows you to deck build around this card while not. And one of the things that I love about this so much, you don't need to build around Birthing Pod to make a good Birthing Pod deck, right? A deck can be very strong, but then you add Birthing Pod and it goes bananas.
And I want to do an homage to my mi amor, Westmoreland here with,
I've built that
Oswald
deck.
Fiddlebender.
I've built this deck.
Like
and I love Ozzy.
Yeah, Ozzy actually fits pretty nicely here.
Fiddle.
So for one colorless and one plains, you get a legendary creature, Gnome Artificer. That's hard to say, like Gnome, Guillaume. Anyways, so magical tinkering for one plains and tap, sacrifice an artifact, search your library for an artifact with mana value equal to 1+ the sacrificed artifact's mana value. Put it onto the battlefield, then shuffle. Activate only as a sorcery for a 2/2. So it's kind of the creature iteration of Birthing Pod. And the reason why I interrupt with this is because our good friend Greg old Greg.
Our good friend Greg.
Our good friend old Greg. He drinks his Baileys from a shoe. He actually talked about and built and executed a Birthing Pod Fiddlebender deck last night in the Bears Artifact Camp.
I have built
Engine Plus.
I have built that
gorgeous.
deck.
It's
I actually,
so much fun.
I highly picked that card in one of our iterations, and I think I remember saying that I for some reason I've had my issues drafting your artifact cube for some reason. I don't know what it is. I never seem to have a great record.
It's difficult. That's why
it is difficult. It is difficult for sure.
It's fair,
but and I generally tend to anyway. My play style, I don't know. That card, I had my most success drafting it with that card and using it as an engine. And I'm typically looking for those engines when I'm drafting your artifact deck because I feel that those are some of the strongest archetypes and the most fun archetypes.
They're the most fun,
but it's a great card.
I want to talk about this next card that I beat Stu with at CubeCon 2022, and it's Bolas' Citadel.
Was it this card?
It was 100% that card. Oh yeah, I went off Rakdos nonsense.
This was a finisher, but I feel like
I'm pretty sure I got so it was Bolas' Citadel for 3 colorless and triple swamps. You get a legendary artifact. You may look at the top card of your library at any time. You may play the top card of your library. If you cast a spell this way, pay life equal to its converted mana cost rather than pay its mana cost. And you can tap it, sacrifice 10 non-land permanents. Each opponent loses 10 life. Name Stu. So this card is fantastic. So these cards in particular really play to that Jennie Johnny type of thing that we're looking for here, right? Like they play into those demographics, those psychographics that were
Psychographics, you're right.
Psychographics, yeah. So I got a couple more. I know we're kind of getting a little long-winded here, but it's interesting because you as a curator want to find cards that actually seek out and develop interesting lines of play. May, would you mind taking on these next two ever so briefly, even though they're the most complex ones I can make you read, please?
Oh yeah, very briefly, is you just give me two relatively complex ones. But that's fine. Golos the Tireless Pilgrim is a 5 mana legendary artifact creature scout. That's a 3/5. When it enters the battlefield, you may search your library for a land card, put it onto the battlefield tapped, shuffle your library. 2 Wooburg, exile the top 3 cards of your library. You may play them this turn without paying their mana costs. And this card is interesting because it lets you tutor any land card from your deck.
Any land.
You can build a sort of, any land.
Great point. Any land.
So you can build your deck as this kind of land toolbox for, say, commander cubes, brawl cubes, whatever. So that way when you're building those decks, you can kind of draft all those land packages in 5 colors and then play Golos, grab whatever land that you're going to need to solve the problem, and then go off from there. And it's interesting because once you get into that payoff area where, all right, I now did the thing, I now have tons of lands, now I can dump a bunch of mana into it to start playing the big dumb spells in my deck. And it is absolutely a deck-altering card. It is a card that somebody picks with the intention of building a specific engine deck, whatever.
Well,
And
I know
the
we
next
put this
card-
to Jennie and Johnny, but do you think those big splashy plays also falls into Timmy and Tammy as well?
No,
I think this
there's a big
appeases-
difference between this and Sneak Attack. It is doing a fundamentally similar thing, but Sneak Attack, like you said, is in the now. I am trying to play something, and I'm trying to get it out. I'm trying to end the turn now. It is my big splashy play. If it doesn't work, oh well, I tried doing the thing. Golos, on the other hand, is not only a built-in engine card because it comes in, immediately tutors whatever lands in your deck, but you could also use it as the mana dump later. It is your payoff. It is your engine. It is your tutor. You can use it as a toolbox expander. There are specific deck-building expectations when you're picking this card.
Versus that Timmy Tammy, where it's less luck, and I don't want to qualify that as the aspect, but like Golos is really set up driven. When you're spinning that wheel, it's purposeful. So therefore it's an
You have to build your
engine.
deck around it.
Correct.
Johnnies are trying to build their engines. They're trying to do their entire deck, or a majority of their deck, to do their thing. They are trying to invest a lot into their game plan. This can be mass reanimation like Living Death. This can be things like trying to get a bunch of lands into play with Golos or whatever, so that way they can get that not only land toolbox to stay alive, but to get their payoff later. Everything is built into building their engine so that way they can get their payoff for the engine. Versus Timmy's, their payoff is playing the big dumb creatures, big dumb spells, whatever, and the immediacy of that is a cost. It is not that their entire deck is built around it. A Timmy player can look at a Leatherback Bailoff and feel pretty good about themselves, or they're going to draft things like that Channel Fireball and understand, oh, I can play the big dumb Fireball, hit somebody in the face, and that is my big dumb spell for the turn. If it gets countered, oh well.
Do you think...
Versus if...
I was going to say, do you think if you just ignore the bottom ability of Golos, right? Two colors Wooburg. If you just ignore that and look at this from the Timmy Tammy perspective of you can pay 5 mana and it's colorless, so anything goes, for a 3/5, which is a little, a little overcosted, but that you get to ramp. Do you think that the ramp aspect, with the fact that this is such an easy card to play, with the fact that the 3 power and the 5 toughness is not insignificant, do you think that that by itself, even ignoring the aspect, is enough for a Timmy Tammy player to look at this and think, I want to draft this card, I don't really care about the Wooburg? Do you think a Timmy Tammy player, or is this, I'll rephrase, do you think this is something that you would, as a curator, put this in and think that a Timmy Tammy player might appreciate outside of the ability?
Y'all can yell at me in the emails later, but in my opinion, this is a card that screams land toolbox, built-in ramp, and it's not the most efficient ramp. It is not the most efficient at what it's trying to do. It's not the most efficient body. But what makes this card appealing, even just ignoring that bottom text of face value, is I get a land toolbox.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And really, my point is, as a curator, if you're looking for ways to be able to sort of cross-pollinate between playstyles, maybe this is a pretty good card for that.
When you see Golos early or in like the middle of your draft, then at that point, you're being like, oh, I want to build the Golos deck. At that point, now you're no longer prioritizing just whatever's the best pick in the pack. Now you're prioritizing what lands do I want to throw in? What big dumb spells do I want to cheat in?
That's me.
How am I going to build this deck in order to do the thing?
Yeah, I take Golos so very highly. Anthony has it in his 2-headed giant cube. We drafted it at CubeCon.
Which we are playing again in 2023.
We are.
Which is already getting booked up,
So
by the way.
for Chill, when you listen to this, we're going to team up.
You're on my team, by the way, Chill.
Forcing Golos.
No,
Get out of here. We're not breaking up the
Chill to
dream
be on my
team. Not a chance. Not a chance.
So I want to revisit a card, though. So there's an interesting point he made, the crossover. So I want to take this one a little bit backwards here. So Sneak Attack. We went back and we kind of categorized that under the Timmy Tammys. We oversimplified it. But what happens, May, when you run a Rakdos iteration of that and you put Reanimator effects into it? So now you're engine procuring, right? You're intentionally...
At that point, it can be an engine card, yes.
Yes. So now you're changing the dynamic of the card.
But my counterpoint to that is, how often are you going to be looking at Sneak Attack and thinking, I'm going to build Rakdos Reanimator?
Always. Like, I want to do Feldon of the third path.
Johnny response, right?
Yeah, I want to do those type of responses. Yes. So it kind of changes
like what we
the
mentioned
aspect
before,
of the card.
that cards can be multifaceted, and a case like Sneak Attack is that it's a card that at face value you can use to cheat in your big dumb spells, your big dumb creatures, etc. And no matter what creature that you put into play, it's going to feel good for the Timmy Tammy player. As opposed to when you look at this and say, I want to build the Rakdos Reanimator package, you are looking at this as a piece of an engine. You are seeing this as another faucet to this deck type that you are trying to construct.
Correct. So, May, I have a question for you. Have you ever wanted to turn a 1/1 green squirrel into a triplicate titan?
Hilarious.
Okay. So, this is what I can do.
Why
I can
squirrel?
offer you, Chill, if you're on my team.
Why
Whereas
squirrel,
all
Anthony?
that really Stu can offer you if you're on his team is Golos. I can offer you the promise of Jalira, Master Polymorphist. For 3 colorless and 1 island, you get a legendary creature, Human Wizard. Pay 2, and then pay 1 island. Tap, sacrifice another creature, reveal cards from the top of your library. We just sacrificed the squirrel on Team Anthony. And until you reveal a non-legendary creature, Triplicate Titan, and put that card onto the battlefield and the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order for a 2/2. So I do run an UberBears 2-headed giant cube, which is going to be featured by the time this has already come out next week. Exciting, where I want to see people go nuts, but I'm really excited about the idea. I run an entire polymorph package, and I think this card is very engine driven. I think the idea of polymorph as a central theme is coming to fruition at some point. I hope we get more cards that do this. I think it's getting more accepted. The destroying of one little tiny creature to make something like an Eldrazi or some kind of triplicate titan, etc. I would love to see more of that, but I think this really fits into that Jennie Johnny type of idea. What do you think about that, May?
Oh, absolutely. This is a card that, again, requires you to build a specific way. It is requiring you to create a specific payoff in order to build your entire deck around that payoff and building your engine around that payoff. When you're in blue, you're going to have a lot of control cards and whatever to just stay alive till you can get your polymorph effect. Once you get your polymorph effect, the rest of your deck is built around cheating that 1 or 2 or 3 cards out.
Just like we saw with Leatherback Bealoth and the Timmys and Tammys, everything has layers in this subgroup too. Stu, would you mind taking on as we move up, in my opinion, complexity levels here?
So now we're going to move. So this is sort of, I would say, at the higher level of the Johnny. So on the Venn diagram, if you will, this is where Johnny starts to move towards the spike. And this is a poster child of Anthony's artifact cube. And this is Krark Clan Ironworks, 4 colorless for an artifact. Very simple. Sacrifice an artifact, add 2 colorless to your mana pool. Where cards like this start to become incredibly powerful is when you combine effects from cards like Scrap Trawler, which is a 3 colorless mana artifact creature construct, 3/2. When Scrap Trawler or another artifact you control is put into a graveyard from the battlefield, return to your hand target's artifact card in your graveyard with lesser mana cost. And Mirror Retriever, which is a 2 colorless mana artifact creature, Mirror, 1/1. When it dies, return another target artifact card from your graveyard to your hand.
And then we also the grand finale.
And we also mentioned Walking Ballista, right? So an incredible payoff card. So these are definitely cards. We're starting to move towards some fairly complex interaction. These are not cards that you're just going to slot into your aggro deck, right? And they are not underpowered necessarily. 3 mana for a 3/2 isn't atrocious. It's very easy to cast, obviously, at 3 colorless mana, but the real high value you're going to get is by combining some of these quote-unquote combo pieces. And this was obviously these 3 cards. Anyone who's familiar with Modern, there was a KCI Modern deck that was extremely powerful. Actually, Krark Clan Ironworks is now banned from Modern. Scrap Trawler and Mirror Retriever were 2 of the massive engine pieces, as well as things like Chromatic Sphere, Chromatic Star. But this definitely requires a fairly complex ability when it comes to deck building, when it comes to drafting, to be able to see these kinds of interactions and these kind of synergies with the cards. We're definitely moving quite far away from, in my opinion, the Timmy Tammy, where you're just looking to put creatures down or you're looking to cast the big dumb spells, turn creatures sideways, that kind of stuff. These are definitely, again, complex interactions.
Yeah, so that Venn diagram is actually an important point that Stu brought up, is that as you as a curator have to offer something for everyone. I'm not suggesting everyone puts infinite combos like we just talked about in their cube environments.
Yep.
But in order to appease these different demographics, these psychodynamics that we've talked about, I have decided to inject these into my environments. I get a little something for everyone, and it's very minuscule, which kind of leads me into this next one that continues along that path. It appeases the spikes, but it also makes the Jennies and Johnnies very happy.
I think that makes the Timmys and Tammys quite happy as well. Talk to us and then think about the creature in that Timmy Tammy context.
Yeah, so the Timmy Tammy would be actually the Gravecrawler, just straight up turn sideways attack, right? And even the big old dumb zombie that's going to be represented when we do this thing. And even the complexity that I've got in our show notes of the Blood Artist. But here's how this combo works that gives a little bit to everyone, right? How do you do that as a curator? Phyrexian Altar, for 3 colorless, you get an artifact, sacrifice a creature, add 1 mana of any color. Well, you sacrifice your Gravecaller that costs 1 swap. Gravecaller can't block. You may cast Gravecaller from your graveyard as long as you control a zombie for a 2/1. So that gave the first Timmy Tammy a little bit of happiness because they want to turn it sideways, right? And then also, you just got to have a zombie, so I represented that in the show notes with just a standard zombie token.
It's not a standard. It may be the greatest zombie
It's a Phyrexian
token.
zombie. It's just goofy and gross and something from your Doom Cube someday that we might see.
That's right.
And then your grand finale is you get that infinite triggers from sacrificing your Gravecrawler to the Phyrexian Altar because you have that zombie token, is you get a Blood Artist trigger. And there's going to be a lot more combos, so we'll talk about in a future episode when we do a primer for how to win at Uberbear's Horror Cube, how to win at Maze Fake Cube, and then others, but it's interesting to see that. So I think it gives a little something. It's very hard to pull together. It's a lot of pieces.
I would agree.
It's got Jennie Johnny engine about it. It's got spikeness to it, but then elements of it also have Timmy Tammy. And so I think it appeases a lot. What do you think about
Ready
that,
for the curveball?
Yeah, do it.
I disagree. I don't think that the engine's difficult here. The thing is that you would definitely draft Gravecrawler if you were just trying to play the black aggro deck. And Blood Artist rewards you for removing their things. It rewards you for your things dying. It rewards you for turning sideways at the same degree that you would get rewarded for sacrificing things. Being able to build into this black aggro package and happening to pick up Blood Artist, Phyrexian Altar in your pack, then suddenly you now have the enabler for it. You now have the thing that turns it into a combo. And I agree that we're starting to get into that overlap, but the thing that makes this overlap into such a strong combination of... So I disagree that these are cards that solely would appeal to a Johnny player. And while Gravecrawler is the main one that overlaps with the Timmy players, I would also say that Blood Artist overlaps with the Spiky players. And the thing about these 3 particular cards is that you could build into that mono black aggro package because Blood Artist rewards you for turning sideways in the same way that it rewards you for removing your opponent's stuff, or it rewards you for creating that sacrifice engine. The step that you have to take to turn this from a black aggro package into a combo package is adding Phyrexian Altar.
I think it's the acknowledgement of that, though. We've announced it, right? Like, so your common Magic player just started Magic won't see those complex pieces, those engine development pieces. They'll see the cards as individual face value. I sacrifice a thing, I get mana. With KCI, I sacrifice a thing, I get mana. With Phyrexian Altar, they may not see past the end of their nose, but the complexity later becomes revealed as you become a veteran with playing Magic and seeing other players do these combos and or you read articles, etc. It's just not intuitive is what I'm trying to say.
I think you could make that argument with any sacrifice effects, right?
It's
especially
complex.
If you are trying to just play mana or play lands, you're trying to put lands on the battlefield, you're trying to put big creatures onto the battlefield. I think rarely are you excited about sacrificing them if that is your goal, right? I can certainly attest to that as someone who, when I was very, very new to Magic again, and green was kind of the way that I got into it because it was simple and straightforward and I'm just putting creatures down and turning them sideways. Do I want to sacrifice them for just 1 mana when I'm trying to play 4 and 5 and 6 mana creatures? Probably not. But to May's point that I will agree with completely is that this combo is so incredibly straightforward and so cheap, and the payoff is so obvious that I do think I really think that should apply and appeal to everybody.
I would argue that it's simpler than the KCI combo.
It's not even in the same universe as
but it requires moving pieces. The cards do read themselves to you and tell you the requirements. That is true. It's the seeing that this takes 4 components.
That all the cards individually are playable to each of these psychographics, but when they come together in this way, they happen to do a cool thing. And that appeals to your Johnny players. Grave Crawlers are going to appeal to your Timmy Tammy players because it's another cheap, aggressive creature that can turn sideways. Blood Artists can appeal to the Spike players because it's just additional value that you can get. There's a lot of different avenues that come together when it comes to these 3 cards.
Maybe it's the infinity aspect of it that could potentially be a stumbling block, even though, again, we can look at this through the lens of people who have played Magic for a long time. But I will state this. I remember when I was first introduced to the Kiki Jiki combos, right? I could not wrap my head around how the Kiki Jiki combo. It took me like 5 minutes of my buddy explaining it to me. I've been playing Magic for like 24 hours and he was explaining this to me. And it took me a few minutes for me to understand it. Similarly with, again, the boogeyman in the room, the EDH deck that I have, the very first time, this was very, very early on when I started playing EDH, and I was looking at, I have a deck with Mizzix of the Is Magnus, and there's a combo with Mizzix where you build up loyalty counters or experience counters, and then you put a ritual effect on the stack, and then you use Reiterate to copy it. And it took me, I'm sitting there scratching my head, thinking, how on earth does this go infinite? And I think that word, the infinite aspect of something, just automatically, at least for me, and feel free to leave comments, Twitters, Discords, all that kind of stuff. It was the infinity aspect of working out how to go infinite with something that was kind of complex and felt a little awkward to me. Now, obviously, it looks incredibly natural, but again, we're all looking through this through the lens of people who have played Magic for a long time, and maybe it's not quite as obvious for a very new player, for someone who might be in that Timmy Tammy category, but definitely simpler than the Crack Clan.
There's not like a clear roadmap, but I will, if I put those 2 combos side by side, Crack Clan Ironworks requires timing to get correct, to hit the Scrap Trawler and the Mirror Retriever, to get the correct timing, the correct place, whereas the other one kind of plays itself. I would agree. Like the Phyrexian Altar Gravecrawler combo it's definitely the simpler of the 2 as far as the roadmap, but I don't think either one of them are just like inherently saying, hey, you're new to Magic, see these 4 cards working together. And that's for any synergy, right? The synergy takes time for you to see.
I think it does, and not just that, but even if you've got some amount of experience, you can go all the way back to reading the list. Like if you know that KCI is in there, that's great. It's a powerful card by itself. But if you know that Scrap Trawler, Mirror Retriever, Chromatic Sphere, Chromatic Star, all that kind of stuff is in there, then it's going to incentivize you to be able to draft a deck like that.
May has a thought.
So I think that is an important understanding when you're building an environment as a curator, is that I will just say it out front that equating Timmy's Tammy's only with new players is kind of a disservice. And it's obviously a conversation we'll have to have for different episodes, is building your environment so that way it's new player friendly, and that's a different design goal. But what is a particular obstacle when it comes to building for your player types and your player psychographics is that when you are building for your Johnny players, you're trying to give them those leads to follow on to. There is a very delicate line between when you are rewarding people for just having experience in Magic that may dissuade people who are newer at Magic from wanting to play with or against those pieces. And when we are looking at the overarching idea of newer player Magic, I don't want to sacrifice my things. I just barely played it. And they aren't going to be able to grasp those complex interactions because they haven't been playing as long, versus solely appealing to the Johnny players. It comes down to the types of players that you're expecting for your pod, what types of psychographics that you're building for. And the thing that's important to note about Timmy's and Tammy's not just being new players is that they can understand complex interactions in the case of things like sneak attack. They can understand that, oh, if I sneak attack a Thragtusk, that's just real good value. It is absolutely a Timmy Tammy play. I am still playing my big dumb creature and getting tons of extra value out of it. But it is not quite in the Johnny category where I'm trying to build my entire engine around doing sneak attack, sacrificing things, reanimating, sneak attacking, and whatever, right?
Let me just say, I will agree, first of all. And I definitely don't mean to be disrespectful to anyone who wants to have that playstyle. I suppose just because that's a point that I bring up quite often during the podcast is me thinking about, me when I was very, very new to Magic, and me thinking about what kind of plays I was both favored towards and what I was capable of. And that's something I'm very cognizant of all the time that I'm thinking about Magic.
It is a good thing to discuss. It's a good thing to bring up.
Yeah.
And it is a good thing to be aware of your player experiences and making sure that you're not overtly rewarding players who know more than the new players.
So I got a question for you, May, and maybe Stu, I'd like for both of you to chime in on this. Do you think that if you designed a cube around the central theme of a Jennie, Johnny type of engine building, are you creating inaccessibility? Are you making your environment harder for people to come in entry point?
Without a doubt. I don't even need to address some of the intricacies of what goes into building a Johnny Jennie cube. Even just among the other psychographics, there is a specific player type that wants to play those kind of decks, that want to draft those kinds of decks. And when you create such a restrictive outlook, and this is what we mentioned earlier with biases, is that when you are building in that bias, it is difficult for people outside that bias to be drawn to that environment. And that in itself is inaccessible. And especially when you start taking new players into account, that the more complex things that you're introducing or ideas that you're introducing, the harder it is for a new player to pick up your cube. And that's something that you have to ask yourself as a curator. Who am I designing for? Who's going to be playing my environment? Who is my audience?
So I have a counterpoint to that. So I think it's an opportunity for learning. It may be, so we'll use our good friend Sandwich's graveyard synergy. And I think a lot of time the word synergy completely interlocks with the Jennie Johnny. Like it's the person looking for engines, right? So the graveyard synergy cube, my loss rate's really high, but my learning rate is very high because every time I play it, I see more intricacies in Magic the Gathering that I didn't see the day before. So they're daunting, they're intimidating, they're not welcoming sometimes, but they're also challenging. And if you want a challenge and you want to move past the turn sideways, and I'm not going to just accuse Timmy Tammy of that aspect, the big dumb creature as you referred to, and you want to elevate your Magic the Gathering experience and press your players, that's the reason why, when we go back, the reason why I run the KCI combo in the Artifact Cube, and the reason why I run the Phyrexian Altar within the Horror Cube, it's to add diversity of insight to the cube so that other players, not all of them are going to appeal to that complexity, but that aha moment may occur not because you pulled it off, May, but because Stu pulled it off and you got to observe it. Then you can do the whole, as I said before, the monkey see, monkey do. You've now learned, and you've learned something cool and interesting that now you're going to strive for. So I think it pushes the limits of the players. You kind of got to know where your groundwork is. Like, what's your entry point, and how long do you want to keep it entry point, right?
How enfranchised is the player that you're referring to?
Exactly.
But I think that eventually evolves, right?
New, they're going to be interested in taking this beating. They're going to be interested in taking that baptism by fire approach.
Yes.
How much are you punishing that new player as opposed to rewarding them for learning something new? But I lost because I got better as a player, and now I understand why I lost, or this new interaction that I didn't think about. Or did I lose because I didn't have the knowledge or experience to take advantage of the environment in a way that the environment was pushing me towards, that I did not have the skills to read? And so, how often is that going to push away somebody who's new for your environment?
Which led to a conversation / debate I had with my good friend Chris, aka Sandwich, that we talked about, is whether or not I should do an announcement, which we already have in this episode, of my combos, right? Make them public knowledge. Are you rewarding everyone for knowing that the KCI combo and how it works? And I would love to talk about it explicitly. Or do you allow that to be enfranchised to the veteran players for the knowledge they have gained.
I think that'll eventually become irrelevant the more that the players become familiar with your cube, because it only takes one time for someone to combo off with whatever combination of cards that they draft for that to then become known to the rest of your play group, right? If you're talking about an insulated number of people that are going to be playing your cube, people that are going to be going to CubeCon as an example. I know for myself, and we talked about this in one of our other episodes, I took the time, certainly during the voting submissions, when the cubes were available on Twitter, I was taking the time to look through all the primers and look through all the lists, see what was out there. Players are going to do the same, but certainly when you're on in a much more tight-knit environment and they're playing a cube multiple times, they're going to see those combos and they're going to become very obvious to the players very quickly. So I don't know if you necessarily need to announce it ahead of time, unless it's something that, you know, hey, we've got a cube that's been played, you know, it's a year-old, 6-month-old, 10-year-old cube or whatever. I've now added these cards that add these combo, just purely because you're, as a curator, you're probably pretty proud of the fact that, like, hey, look at this cool new combo, look at these cool new interactions that I've added to my cube. But I think in general, the players they're going to find out organically.
And we're going to announce it next week when we do our charity event for Extra Life. We talked about that. I'm going to announce it as also includes the KCI combo, also includes the Phyrexian Ultra combo, but I'm not going to provide this, you know, roadmap of details. Just because some people are going to nod their head and others don't, but I think it's a learning moment for everyone.
Agreed.
So
I think it's a case where you can use external tools to supplement what you're trying to portray with the cards that you're putting in.
Right. So let's kind of move over to the next player, and it's the player that I claim to be on my draft experience. It's also the type of player that I am not when I'm curating. Stu, would you mind reading this from our good friend Preston? We're going to copy his homework again.
Yeah, so again, shout out to Preston. So I'm going to quote this verbatim again. Spikes like to win, but I think that creating an environment for them is more nuanced than, quote, add good cards, unquote. Winning for a spike is a demonstration of their skill, the reward for drafting and playing well. The more meaningful decisions that a spike can make in a game, the more they will feel that their skill matters. As spikes will often consider the format, offering a variety of viable strategies will keep them interested in a particular cube. Power outliers will appeal to spikes, but will be most satisfying when they are subtle and or format specific, as other players may undervalue them. Spikes also appreciate efficiency and flexibility, as these traits will often give cards more decision density and opportunity to accrue advantage. When curating for spikes, consider that cards with random effects or bombs that win regardless of game state will make them feel like their skill matters less.
Really brings us back to that Guafa Hazid conversation we had earlier, on, right? And it ties that off. Preston was saying that although it doesn't on paper, face value, look good, but the context of the environment, a spike would adapt to it and then adjust and realize that they should bring this card in.
I think that really highlights how much of a mental state that it is, potentially at the time of the draft or at the time of playing, rather than it does just inherently the type of person that player is, right? Because I think you can go into any draft, any cube night with any one of those mentalities.
So it's what I said earlier about how spikes care more about their demonstration of skill, and absolutely Preston hits the nail on the head with this. So what I was saying earlier is that spikes care a lot about advancing their skills. And the reason why Hafa can be seen as a spike card, because you can see it in the context of the environment and understand that there is a lack of outs to this card, and there is an appeal to have that. And with spike players looking at that kind of package of how am I going to improve my skill at drafting, at deck building, and at playing the deck, they are looking at these individual pieces to improve themselves. And when it comes to designing your environment for your spikes, it is absolutely more complex than just add good cards. And this is why I debated you earlier when you said that Vorthos was the hardest to appeal to. I think spikes are the hardest to appeal to, because there is an innate complexity that comes with it more than just, oh, put in the good cards, put in all the best cards. Spikes want to figure out the meta. They want to solve it. They want to figure out what's going to increase their win percentage. What is the best optimal draft routes for them to take? What they are looking for in their cards, in their packs, etc., is things to meaningfully show their skill. And when you have cards that take away from that skill, then they leave the draft feeling defeated, win or lose, because it feels like their skill did not matter in that engagement. It was one of the big reasons that I had to make several changes in my cubes, was because I have a bunch of spike players. And one of the first things that I had to learn adjusting my cube for a bunch of spike players is understanding that it's not just about the good cards. It's about them figuring out the good cards in the environment to play towards the meta, to play towards the environment, because they're looking to show off that skill.
Yeah, I would, and I'll actually raise a point about that. And it wasn't me that, and I don't consider myself a spike, but I will talk about one of the times we were drafting. It was Anthony's horror cube, which is a big favorite of mine. And we were playing with the aforementioned Kevin Spike in our group. God bless Kevin, happily married now. I was drafting a spirits deck. And I will say that I've drafted Anthony's cubes many times, and this was, I think, in a vacuum, maybe the most powerful by cube deck that I've ever drafted. I don't know if everyone just kind of looked at spirits and didn't pay any attention to them, but I got literally everything that I could possibly wish for in my perfect spirits deck.
They spirited away.
I spirited all the spirits away. Exactly. And I played a game against Kevin, and I won on turn 4 both times. And I remember the first game that I played, or maybe it was the second game.
Spell Queller
4
and
or
stuff
5.
like that too.
Yeah, it was literally just spirit, hold up Spell Queller, turn 4. I think I played a Lord or something like that, swing for win. And I remember he looked at me and he said, "There's no way that just happened." That was exactly what he said to me. There's no way that just happened. Because he considers himself a strong Magic player. I don't know how he considers me. He probably considers me a reasonable Magic player, which is probably a fair estimation. But he looked at that like he couldn't believe. And I don't know if it was the way that he considered the deck that he drafted or the power level of the cube. But I remember his face just, he couldn't believe that he'd lost so quickly, right? His skill level was irrelevant. Right, either the way that he was playing his deck. I don't know about the way he drafted. I wasn't obviously looking over his shoulder when he drafted, but his skill was irrelevant because the power level of that deck that I drafted was just so obnoxious. And I'm pretty sure that it was either a 3-0, 6-0 or a 3-0, 6-1 in that
Which
instance of us drafting.
Leads me
but
to
it was
a point
absurd.
that I've been dying to make this whole episode is that the opponent sitting across the table drives your psycho
analysis.
Exactly. And
Psychosocial.
It encourages you to push harder, right? So you laser a little bit. So we've actually labeled Kevin multiple times this episode as our spike within the group. He's the quote unquote self-proclaimed S tier player. So
I think
you sit across the table
from
from
that.
We play harder. You engage a little harder. You're actually really intentional with your moves when you play against Kevin. Would you agree?
Yeah,
Or
I
you
would
get
say
a little bit more relaxed when you and I play.
No, I think because you are so desperate to beat me because my record against you is so lopsided in my favor.
Probably accurate, but your opponent drives your personality while you're making your choices as the player. I do believe that actually creates another dynamic to your choices where you might play a little softer, make a little lighter plays, a little
looser,
little loosey-goosey, right? But when you're playing against a player that's really stated as a really good player, it's kind of that Karate Kid, the best around, right? It's coming online.
Nothing's going to ever keep you down.
Nothing's ever going to keep you down. And you want to just hit all those lines perfectly. So you think about them more than you do when you're playing a kind of a casual match.
Sure.
Even though it's not announced as casual.
Yeah, I would agree.
So it creates like this interesting dynamic within the gameplay as well as a player, is that the players generate that dynamic
Yes.
that you weren't expecting. On top of, you may have built your deck to do this thing, but now you play your deck differently because the player personality across the table is just frankly someone you want to beat.
Oh, yeah. So let's talk about some spike cards. So May, we've got, and as always to our listeners, check out the show notes. Challenge for you. Take a look at the 4 cards right below the spike. What, in your opinion, is the most spiky card in this group? And tell us why.
And we'll actually name those are
Coslick.
Dismember, Inquisition of Kozilek, Ragavan Nimble Pilfer,
Ragavan.
and a Fury.
And a Fury.
And a Fury.
Inquisition of Coslick. Not even close.
Okay.
The reason
Tell me why. Yeah.
The reason why is because there is complex decision-making that comes with Inquisition of Kozilek that doesn't just come from the 3 other good cards. Of course, Dismember is one of the best 1-mana removal cards out there. Of course, Ragavan is the best 1-drop. Of course, Fury is just an evoke card that you can cast for free.
Death Right
Of course,
Shaman.
these 3 are good cards. But what makes Inquisition of Kozilek the most spiky card is not just that it's a good card, it is innately complex in a way that rewards players' skill. It is the way that spikes can use it as a turn 1 way to deny your opponent's resources so that way they can prepare their strategies and their game plan so that way they can do the most efficient things and be rewarded for that decision. Or they can use it to establish their own advantage later in the game because they can target themselves with it to toss something in the graveyard to reanimate it. It is very efficient at multiple things, and that decision-making is what makes it a spike card.
And I think the real definer between these 3 cards, although those are exceptionally spiky, is Kozilek is proactive. The others are pseudo-reactive.
I don't know. I would say obviously Dismember is incredibly reactive because it's Fury. A removal spell, and I would actually say that Fury can act as both a reactive and a proactive spell.
Whereas Ragavan is
Ragavan's just a proactive.
It's just a proactive, and I would actually, following on from your point, mate, and I agree 100%. I would actually say that a spike, the reason why I think this is such a definition of a spiky card, things like Inquisition of Kozilek, Grief, Thoughtseize, is because they provide information. Yep. And if you are trying to play a spiky kind of deck, if we're going to sort of categorize the spiky decks as the KCI kind of decks and the combo decks and all that kind of stuff, information is potentially more valuable to a player like that or to someone who's playing a deck like that than someone who is just trying to turn big dumb creatures sideways.
So let's do this again. So I've got another grouping here. And it's Grief, Dark Confidant, and Gitaxian Probe.
Yes.
May, which one of those is the spikiest of the spikes?
Gitaxian Probe.
100% agree.
Yeah.
Not even close.
Probe.
Yeah, because it really appeals to the efficiency. It's free.
That lets me draw a card and look at my target player's hand. That is fantastic. That is so much of an advantage in terms of information. And it actually reduces the amount of cards in my deck for 2 life. That is the spike card.
I would agree 100%. So kind of like the gist is what we've gotten out of this is spikes are chasing. They want complexity. They want to feel like they earned the win.
They want to kind of show off a little bit.
They want to show off a little bit. And yeah, I think you said this earlier on, that there's a little bit of tinge of ego here. Ego is happening, whether or not, and if the spikes are ruffling, if their quills are coming out right now, it's probably because this is true. But May, what do you think?
I think that there is a slight disservice that we're doing and not
we always
about,
do.
Fact or fiction of all cards. Fact or fiction, in my opinion, is one of the perfect examples of a weird minigame mechanic that spikes love. And
forcing the decision of your opponent, I can see that. Like you're forcing them, you're putting them on the spot to choose the best or the worst outcome. Fact or fiction makes total sense to me.
Because they're trying to take advantage of a skill deficit. And
I would agree
fact
with
or
that.
fiction is
terrible
more powerful
that card
the
feels
higher
terrible
that
now.
The skill deficit is.
Yeah, 100%. So the gist is that as a curator, we want to create diversity in our environments. I think we all kind of, the takeaway that we all got here is that your environment should never really placate to one of the 3 majors or the Vorthos and sorry, Melvin, but we really shouldn't play to these, right?
Hey, I'm Melvin, apparently.
I'm Melvin too, a little bit. But I think everybody's a little bit of something, right? I don't think we can all, but I think everybody has a singular that kind of really draws a thin red line about their personality, and that's okay. But I think our curation really needs to be developed about, like May mentioned, the play group has a lot to say in this. I also think that you should graduate your play group. I don't think you can stay in Timmy and Tammy forever. And I don't mean to downplay that. And as May mentioned before, it's not meant to say that's entry level, but Turn Sideways has to evolve at some point in order to keep the interest of your players. But I think a nice, neat blend of this is okay, because Stu also mentioned, that it's also about a mood sometimes. It's not about your personality. It's about that day, hard day at work, don't want to think too much, don't want to do too many things, don't want to deal with Dark Confidant, kind of feeling the whole...
I just want to play Ragavan turn one and swing it.
Leatherback Bailoff, just want to do that because it's Tough Friday, right?
Exactly.
But other days you're feeling pretty great and you want to do Gitaxian Probe because you're online, right? So I think having that diversity across your cubes, the rainbow of these different psychodynamics that we talked about, and thank you, Preston, is really important from a cube curation standpoint and hard to predict. And I also would state that it's important, as May mentioned, to gauge your play group to see if it's accessible. Like having something that's Jennie, Johnny exclusive may not play to what you think it is. It may be so robust, so complex, but also not entry level and not allowing people to actually want to come back and play, because I think this has been said a lot. Like, I know ChillMTG has said this a lot. I actually won in my cube last night. I think the worst feeling for a curator is to play their cube and to win consistently. It says a lot. Like, you've designed the entire game state to play around what you desire. And I don't think that's what you're looking for. Would you agree, Stu?
No, I would disagree. I'm when the cube that I would play, I want to win every game.
How about you, May? Dismissing Stu.
I also disagree, not because you should be playing to, I want to win all the games that I want to play, but to the aspect of when we're curating a cube, we're trying to create an environment to play with the cards that we're interested in.
I kind of want to counterpoint to that. I want to play the cards that I am interested in as a person, but I also want to open it up a little bit for you and Stu to want to play with me. So I try to think outside the box. I don't think it's fair for me to, like, the Monopoly cube has
those
trains.
Things can be true.
Trains made me giggle.
Yeah. Both these things can be true. They are not mutually exclusive.
I would agree with that. Mm-hmm. So it's kind of the tailoring the experience to the following, or whether or not you want it to be standalone. Do you want it to be incorporated around your type of play style, or do you want it to be to your group's play style, or can you find a subtle blend?
Yeah, and I think the Vorthos element, unless you're, looking at that super high power level and just everything is min-maxing, I think a lot of cubes, and maybe you could attest to this with the kind of cubes that you have, you're trying to tell that story. You're trying to tell something with the cube that you're making. And maybe that Vorthos element will just kind of organically find its way into the cube. And therefore, if someone is interested in building a story and looking at those story elements to see, again, where the synergies could be, because they've got cards from a similar set or the same set, same block, whatever the case may be, you may be in a position where those elements of that Vorthos can sort of organically drive players in a direction. So, but yeah, I agree. I think you want to be able to cater for all players and all player types, but that doesn't mean that player is only interested in that player type. I agree 100%. I'm sometimes just looking for turning creatures sideways, and sometimes I'm looking for something with a bit of complexity and a bit of synergy. It all just depends on the day.
So it can be challenging as a curator to hit the benchmarks of your Timmys and Tammys with the big splashies. It's hard to hit the Jennies and Johnnies where you want to get the engine, the birthing pods, or the spikes are looking for the hyper efficient cards.
And maybe Melvin.
However it can be solved. Maybe Melvin will show up.
Well, maybe Melvin is like the balancing act, right? Because if the Melvin is kind of taking that, again, as we talk about that 40,000 foot view of the cube, and he's really looking at all the synergies and all the interactions, then maybe that kind of player is the one. This may be going way above, but is that the best player to give you an idea about what things might fit, what things might not fit? Maybe they're not even interested in the story elements. Maybe they're more looking at how all the cards interact with each other. They're looking at those power outliers, and maybe those are the kind of players that can potentially offer some very, very good feedback. A spike are, not that they don't want to, but they're going to be inclined towards taking those high power level cards and kind of thinking, I want to win with this card. The Timmy Tammy players are thinking, I don't really care. I just want to turn the creature sideways or cast the big dumb spells. And the Melvins are kind of taking that grander approach. So I don't know, maybe just because I consider myself that kind of player, and I do tend to give Anthony a lot of feedback about your cubes.
I think with the Melvins, you give them over salted popcorn and you tell them your water was shut off that day. And
I like oversalted popcorn. Put some butter on it.
So we're kind of moving to our socials. May, do you have any final thoughts?
Nope.
All right, all right, we're going to move over to our socials. I hope this was a really fun episode. Stu, would you take us away, please?
So if you love the show, as we say, we would really appreciate you. Leave a 5-star review for us on your chosen podcast format. We'd really appreciate it. Get the word out there. Get exposure to more and more magic people out there. We have our Alter Sleeves affiliate link. Go to altersleeves.com/UberCube. You'll get 5% off your purchase. You can also use our Inked Gaming affiliate link. Check out the socials for that if you want to get some cool playmats, dice bags, mouse pads, etc. All kinds of really cool custom products available. Check us out at the Twitters, at UberCubeMTGPod, if you want to reach out to us via email, as did the most wonderful Preston. Again, shout out to Preston for his massive contribution to this show. We can be reached at UberCubeMTGPodcast@gmail.com. And as always, please come and check us out and hang out with us on the Discord. All kinds of cool conversations. Community's growing by the day. And as always, I'm gonna put a big plug in there for my deck boasting channel. Come show us the cool decks that you've drafted.
Yeah, so we actually have some really cool decks that have been posted recently.
We have.
And tell us about the Patreon, May.
Tell us about the Patreon.
Thank you, Preston. I appreciate it. And our other Patreons, it's been really great. I hope this episode has satisfied what you have asked of us. I'm sure there's a lot more to talk about these 3+2 different psychodemographics or psychographics that we can talk about. Yep. But this is the robust as we can go today.
I think so too. So let's do what we always do at the end here. And we'll say to you guys,
Happy Cube Spiking Vorthos.
Close enough.